Fisherman. Once upon a time, on an island called Diz, there lived a fisherman called Dat Ding. I know because he was always seen on the dockside with rod and basket, as well as a flask of some concoction for a drink and a pack of sandwiches. He hated those undisciplined and disrespectful outsiders in their sleek motorboats, slicing through the water as though they owned the place, when in actual fact they were only around for the summer months to disturb the peace and tranquility which he considered his by right. Well, Dat Ding did not have much opportunity to indulge in conversation, except when he bought the few supplies he needed from the local store. He had a problem with some of his letters when he spoke, so he restricted his speech as much as possible. Mr. Dalton, the shopkeeper, couldn't help noticing that he had trouble with his THs, and wondered whether he might have been French by birth or some other foreign national. He speculated the fisherman didn't have a proper name because he was always known by his now lost family as that thing, which, when corrupted by him to Dat Ding, sounded a bit oriental. Dat Ding was on the dock when a motorboat approached. He glowered at the scantily clad girls, who all seemed to be sipping champagne and laughing about something hilarious, but to him completely inane. There was one solitary man who looked like the helmsman of this vessel of flaunted debauchery. "My good fellow, take this rope and be so kind as to twirl it round that thingy over there," pointing to the capstan. At first Dat Ding looked blankly at the man, as if to say, "Who, me?" Then the man lunged forward with the aforementioned rope and forced it into Dat Ding's hand. Dat Ding had put down all his things, and was not best pleased at being prevented from walking briskly to his usual vantage point on the dock, where he would sit down and pass the time of day, pursuing his favourite occupation. His frown grew increasingly fierce, and he wanted the captain of this reckless expedition to be aware of his obdurate displeasure. Dat Ding was a prudish bigot. He would have found fault in anyone but himself. The trouble was, he hardly ever had occasion nor the will to compare himself to other lesser mortals. He led a solitary life, and he was content with that. He hated any intrusion or interruption to the rhythm of his routine, which he did not consider to be in the least dull and inconsequential. Mr. Dalton had tried to engage him in conversation on several occasions, but failed every time. He had not the slightest idea who Dat Ding really was, or if he had any family. It seemed as though Dat Ding had deliberately set out to maintain this air of detachment from the world to which he chose not to relate, because it had no attractions for him. He did once very briefly mention in a single sentence to Dalton that he had been to London, but that it had been a big mistake. He then said nothing more to elaborate on the reason as to why. He just left the remark to lodge in Mr. Dalton's mind. The latter realized there was no point in further inquiries, and kept to the business of serving Dat Ding as a customer. The latter stood on the dock, eyeing these females accompanying their skipper, who displayed a flashy, insipid grin. Dat Ding was certainly not going to help these foreign intruders daintily set foot on his territory. He just glared, hoping they might change their minds and go back to where they came from. He was sorely disappointed when they all trotted along to Mr. Dalton's shop, the captain leading the way like a cavorting shepherd with his dotty flock. Dat Ding grimaced but said nothing. They had taken not the slightest bit of notice of him, and they had completely ignored him. Perhaps they might not even have seen him. So they decided not to stop and listen to his pearls of wisdom, which he had cultivated over many years of observation of the human condition. Remember what he thought about himself, and what Mr. Dalton thought of him bore no resemblance whatsoever. There was no connection between the two. One was more accurate than the other, perhaps brutally so. The other was just plain fantasy, created out of a sense of self-importance. Dat Ding took his basket, rod, and pack of sandwiches, and they walked to the end of the dock. After the necessary preparations, he then skillfully cast his line over the side and sat down on one of the deck chairs to wait for a bite. Every day was blissful, even when he caught nothing. If he did, it was a bonus. However, interruptions to his schedule brought on his palpitations, which necessitated the tiresome taking of prescribed drugs to stabilize them. He felt a deep resentment to anyone who, through their proximity to his hallowed space, coupled with their boorish behavior, caused this unnecessary decline in his general fitness. As he fulminated on the day's major catastrophic event, he began to work out in his mind a plan of action that would resolve the inconveniences he had to endure from the loud-mouthed sluts and their Lothario. He questioned whether the boat should sink slowly or capsize with all hands on deck. He decided to listen to any indication as to whether they were to stay around for more than 24 hours. He would give them the chance to get away unscathed if they did so that day, even if it was a night. However, he would have to do something he vowed he would never do, and that is to talk to Mr. Dalton. Dat Ding stayed at his command post for all the morning and most of the afternoon. During that time, the unruly crowd had got back on board and just cruised around several times, sometimes with the boat anchored in the small harbour, lying on deck in some provocative poses and sunbathing almost naked. With his thick-rimmed glasses, Dat Ding could clearly see that was the case. The more he peered at them, the more they seemed to bait him to react to their lewd and disgusting behaviour. He couldn't be sure that they were, but he felt it. You might say he was becoming a bit too interested in the bodies strewn all over the deck of the boat. Of course, it would be difficult to prove you were wrong in your assumptions about him, as a consequence of his intense study of the scene. Sometimes he quite forgot the reason for his sitting at the end of the dockside, especially since the rod had not moved a muscle for hours now. Perhaps he got so bored that he had been tempted to divert his attention to a more obvious activity. Dat Ding was fast becoming so fixated on some devilish scheme to rid himself of the nuisance which had appeared from out of the distant horizon that he began to daydream and fall into a state of semi-consciousness. In a similar situation as when 30 minutes had gone without the driver being aware of the fact, whilst driving on a freeway straight as an arrow and with hardly any traffic. In a short while after, unbeknown to him, all had embarked on board, Dat Ding saw the boat, or what was left of it, sink quickly into the deep water of the lake. But somehow he didn't link this scene with any previous encounter or thoughts he may have had. He heard the explosion, and then screams and hands and bodies flying in the air, but it didn't really concern him. He looked at all that was happening as though he'd gone to the movies. Mr. Dalton rushed out of his shop, but helplessly watched as gradually everything went silent and still. He turned to Dat Ding and gave him a quizzical stare, as if to ask if he knew the reason for this tragedy. Dat Ding's face betrayed no sign of recognition, even if he possessed any. In a rare exchange, Mr. Dalton informed him that of course the local constabulary would have to be informed so as to set up an investigation of the crime scene. The question was, who had committed such a heinous act? In his confused state of mind, Dat Ding would stick to his story that he just wanted to go fishing that day.